Welcome back to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas. My name is Ken Hicks. Our third presentation, we're going to deal with the democratic ideal. When I first taught this class, I think it was at the University of South Carolina in the 1990s, and the status of democracy was different then. At that point in time, pretty much, you'd had a dramatic expansion. Of course, the Soviet Union had collapsed. Most of the countries of Eastern Europe had begun moving in a westward direction and were adopting more democratic governments. And the status of democracy at that point was really unquestioned. And that was the tone of most of the texts dealing, that kind of treated with the issue of democracy. That's no longer the case. Democracy is increasingly seen as problematic. For a variety of reasons, and that's one of the things we're going to be exploring over these next couple of courses, or next couple of presentations. We're going to start with a brief introduction and kind of again talk a little bit about what democracy means. Just like with ideology, we have to be clear about the concepts we're discussing. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of democracy in ancient Greece. We're going to talk a little bit about two of the folks from that period that really articulated what was desirable about democracy. First, Pericles and his funeral oration, and then a selection from Aristotle. Third, we're going to move on to the emergence of democracy and republicanism, which is again a more nuanced version of democracy that includes elements of limited government. We're going to talk about the relationship between Christianity and democracy, and if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about the Renaissance and the return of democracy to kind of prevalence. It's important to keep in mind with ideas. Ideas don't die, right? They may fall out of favor for a period of time, but they oftentimes have this, have the sense of recrudescing, recovering relevance. Again, back to the time when I first was teaching Intro to Political Ideas, fascism was viewed as sort of an antiquity, as sort of a curiosity, some bad thing that was a culmination of things that happened in the 20th century. But the general sense was, well, this can't happen again. But of course, now we're seeing increasingly, political ideologies emerge and people advocating political ideas that sure look a lot like fascism. So again, while democracy has oftentimes appeared to have universal appeal, and frankly, people who are not particularly democratic oftentimes claim they are, there are wide differences in interpretation. We have to get back to this idea of essentially contested concepts. And again, the problem with some of these really important political ideas that we play with is that they are by nature controversial because they lack a clear set of standards for establishing their meaning. For example, again, with democracy, there is the sense in which we could define democracy by a set of procedures and say, well, if you have certain kinds of elections, if a certain percentage of the electorate is eligible to vote, if there are political institutions that are responsive to the will of the people, well, then you have a democracy. And then you have much more substantive ideas about democracy, which include the idea that people have more genuine choices. There's a wider range of options available to voters. Voters have more things on which they can weigh in. There is a democratic culture well established that where everyone involved in democratic practices accept the legitimacy of counterparts and rivals and compete for power and influence in a good faith manner. Those are two very different kind of criteria for what constitutes democracy. So the question arises, does democracy mean the same thing it meant for Nelson Mandela as it does for Vladimir Putin? Putin has made the argument that his rival in the war between Russia and Ukraine, that Volodymyr Zelensky, is not legitimate because they haven't had elections since 2018. Well, they haven't had elections since 2018 because they've been under attack. It's kind of hard, and in fact, the Ukrainian constitution basically bars national elections in a time of war. And so again, the problem with democracy, like the problem with freedom, is that it's really hard to define, and that indeterminacy creates a great deal of room where people can have reasonable but conflicting visions of what that concept means. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the origins of democracy. Democracy emerged in ancient Greece. It was not the dominant mode of political organization. But again, it's also important to keep in mind that Greece itself was not a country as we would understand it. It was rather a nation, right, which we talked about in a previous conversation. The basic unit of Greek political organization was known as the polis, which was a city-state. So Athens, which was on the southeastern portion of the mainland of Greece, with the Peloponnesus peninsula below it, that was its own separate political unit. It had allies, it had enemies. Athens was the largest of those city-states that practiced what we would call democracy. And it's important to keep in mind that democracy in ancient Greek was a compound term. Demos meant people, okay? Kratein meant to rule. And so in simple terms, democracy simply means the people rule. The problem is defining who the people are, right? So for the Greeks, democracy meant basically rule by the lower economic strata of a city-state, which for many Greeks, many of the Greeks that we know about that wrote and hence have their voices kind of echo to us through history, they likened democracy to mob rule. It's also important to keep in mind that the mob in Athens, in particular, was really quite small in comparison to the larger populace of Athens. Athens was by most accounts the largest of the city-states of Athens. It had a population in excess of 250,000 inhabitants. However, only typically 1 in 10, anywhere from 20 to 40,000 Athenians were actually citizens, meaning that they were empowered to go to the agora, to the big public space, and to hear and offer arguments on what the Athenians ought to be doing in the affairs of state. And so democracy in the ancient world was really a rough and tumble affair. There was a great deal of animosity between the landed nobility, the people that owned lands outside of Attica that had large holdings. And again, in the ancient world, land meant you could grow crops. Crops meant that you could sell them. That meant you had money. That was the basis of wealth. And also you could have slaves. The Athenians, though they were democratic, also had slaves. They were an empire of sorts. There was lots of things that were kind of paradoxical to the modern mind. The Athenians had very strict citizenship requirements. And again, the constitution created by Solon, I think in around 600 BC, basically required that a person's grandparents had to be Athenian citizens in order for a person to be a citizen. Women were routinely excluded from public affairs. They were allowed to operate their households. They may have had influence with their husbands, but in practical terms, they had no voice. They could not go to the agora to again participate in the affairs of state. And again, the agora, that big public space in open ground, was where politics was waged. And so one of the mechanisms of Athenian democracy was the idea of ostracism, that if a person became exceptionally powerful and influential and began getting too big for their britches, as it were, then somebody could put them forward for ostracism. And in that instance, each person would be given a piece of pottery, an ostrakon, which they would scribble a name on that ostrakon. And if a certain percentage of the people who voted actually put that person's name on their ostrakons, that person would be banished from Athens for a period of 10 years. 10 years is a very long time in the ancient world. Very oftentimes that could be a death sentence if the person did not have supporters in other city-states where they could live and be supported. So democracy, and again, the way the ancients practiced democracy reveals its fatal flaw. If there are not limitations on majority rule, democracy is only as good as the people practicing it. And in practical terms, that means that factionalism and sectionalism and political strife oftentimes broke out in violence. There were assassination clubs. There were drinking clubs as well that were very political in origin, where nobles would basically have a very generous table and give away lots of wine in order to protect and to draw supporters. So Athenian democracy was a very rough and tumble affair. And of course, Socrates, who was sort of an apocryphal figure, we think he might have existed, but he didn't write anything down. His protege, Plato, did all the writing. And he was widely reputed to be kind of first martyr to the principle of freedom of thought and speech in Athenian democracy. He ran afoul of very wealthy and powerful people. He criticized Athens and criticized the way Athenian democracy worked. And ultimately, the first three of the Platonic dialogues really deal with Socrates' trial, condemnation, and subsequent acceptance of his death sentence. He was condemned to die by the voluntary taking of poisoning. He willingly did so, saying he did so because he loved Athens too much to go into exile and into flight. So people like Plato, who obviously had a real reason to be, for animosity towards those people who were, dominant in Athens at the time, and his protege Aristotle, both philosophers, basically had a sort of highbrow critique of democracy. And the dominant narrative of the ancient Greeks regarding democracy was that it was unstable. Democracy places too much authority in the hands of an otherwise ignorant mass, a group of people who are prone to resentment and to envy. And in hard times, the demos are often easily rallied to despots, to populists who will promise a chicken in every pot. Okay? And so that creates, again, this sense in which, most of the American people who drafted our Constitution were well aware of Aristotle and Plato's, ideas regarding democracy. Another interesting kind of, illustration of how ancient democracy was and the criticisms of it was Aristotle's typology of governments. He basically said all governments can be broken into, basically 6 total types based on 2 criterion: rule by, and whether that government is pure or corrupt. And what did Aristotle mean by corruption? In simple terms, for him and for us really, corruption simply means that you are not governing in the interests of a whole political community. Rather, you are governing selfishly, or you are governing in the interests of a narrow subset of society. And so Aristotle said basically, you can have rule by the one, rule by the few, or rule by the many. And when you have rule by the one and everything is going well, and the monarch, the king, the person you've put in power is benevolent and has good judgment and a good nature, that is monarchy. That person is more interested in governing in the interests of the whole than in his or her narrow interests. However, when you get a tyrant, when you get a person who is selfish and grasping and suspicious and paranoid, then you're apt to fall into tyranny. When you have rule by a narrow set of nobles who again are interested in the whole, who care more about the whole than their personal interests, then you have aristocracy. But when that noble group becomes again selfish, when they pull up the ladder of success, when they rule solely in the interests of the aristocracy, then it is a corrupt form of government known as oligarchy. Note that Aristotle places democracy as a corrupt form of government. For him, rule by the many that is pure is known as polity. And for him, polity meant a limited government where you had elements of rule by the one, rule by the few, and rule by the many. So democracy ultimately dies, and in the ancient world. And like I said, it doesn't really die. It's simply kind of driven out of relevance because it fails the basic test of survival. In the ancient world, you had to be able to generate sufficient manpower to defeat foreign aggressors. Okay? The Greek city-states were able to defeat the Persian Empire. However, the Macedonian Empire that was emerging around that time, led ultimately by Philip and then subsequently by Alexander the Great, presented a much greater challenge. And frankly, they were, the Macedonians were more innovative in the ways of warfare than the Persians had been. And they also were very adept at dividing the Greeks among themselves. And so ultimately, again, this is a problem that Sheldon Wallen's great book, Politics and Vision, points to the fact that, again, the Greeks' vision of what constituted public life was so narrow and so parochial, and they were so envious of their fellow Greeks, Athenians against Spartans, Spartans against Argosans, Argosans against whatever other city-state there was at hand, that they couldn't unify for a common collective good to resist the Macedonians. And so ultimately they failed that basic test, and you had the rise of Alexander the Great, and then you had the emergence of the great empires, first of Alexander and then the subsequent Ptolemaic empires that were the kind of leftovers of Alexander, what Alexander did. And then finally you had the emergence of the Roman Empire. Okay? So let's talk briefly, again, in continuing what was valuable about democracy. Let's consider Pericles' funeral oration. If you get the chance to read it, it is one of the first, kind of viewed as pieces of great oratory. Athens had a tradition of holding kind of ceremonial funeral times for in times of war to mourn the dead and to praise their successes and their bravery. And Pericles took this opportunity to make a kind of appeal to the Athenians, knowing that they were in the opening days of what would become known as the Peloponnesian Wars, which would last for a very, very long period of time and would ultimately lead to Athens' downfall, but they didn't know that at the time. Pericles was often viewed as the first citizen of Athens. He exerted enormous influence over Athenian politics for nearly 40 years. He was born into a noble family. He was very well connected, very wealthy. He self-consciously, chose politics as a way of advancing his family's fortunes. He rose to power both through his eloquence, but also through his very lavish use of his personal wealth. And again, this was a common pathway to prominence in the ancient world. If you were viewed as open-handed, you could get allies. Now, of course, how you treated those folks, when they were in your employ, dictated how long they would stay loyal to you. Pericles was very adept at the use of ostracism and various citizenship laws to maintain power. Athens rose to greatness as a commercial maritime empire, using the navy they built during the wars against Persia to really expand both their commercial influence, but also their military. They became an empire, and that stoked the fears of the rival city-state of Sparta, which was very much an oligarchy, very much driven by very narrow. They basically controlled most of the Peloponnesus. They relied heavily on slavery. Spartan males were all considered they had to be trained for warfare. Sparta was the most feared of the military. Their infantry was vaunted and very fear-inducing. So Pericles understood, and this was in the opening years. He delivered this address, I believe actually just a few months before he died in a plague that swept through Athens early in the war, that really put Athens at a severe disadvantage going in. So this really is sort of the ancient analog to the Gettysburg Address. He's extolling the virtues of Athenian democracy, basically making the argument that Athens' openness is a strength. They don't require, they don't require the kind of dictatorship that Sparta required to hold on to their people. So the Athenian citizen, in contrast to the more heavily regimented and militarized Spartans, were lovers of art, lovers of reading, loved music. They prefer to meet danger with a light heart and without laborious training. We alone regard a man who takes no interest in public affairs not as harmless, but as a useless character. This is an important aspect of Athens' strength, is that they were unified in their belief that their openness was much to be preferred to the way Sparta lived their lives. Pericles extolled Athens as the school of Hellas, Hellas being the Hellenes, the Greeks. The individual Athenian was highly adaptable. The greatness of Athens lies in the aspirations of its citizens. Athens' wealth has not diminished, but rather has enhanced its citizens' hunger for greatness. Athenians fight and die not in fear, but in the hopes of being worthy of their city. This is really, again, one of the first times you see this sense in which people are saying democracy makes people better, makes people stronger, makes our community more cohesive. We don't need force and power and coercion to hold us together. We have only, to set this standard that causes people to want to be Athenian. You also have, again, Aristotle in his various political writings offering a really interesting defense of the middle class. And again, he's defending the proposition that many heads are better than one. So again, who was Aristotle? He was an ancient Greek philosopher. He lived from 384 to 322 before the Christian era. He founded a rival school to Plato's academy in Athens known as the Lyceum. He was the tutor of Alexander the Great. Aristotle, unlike Plato, was not an Athenian. He was a Styrigian, and hence was not an Athenian citizen. But like his mentor, Aristotle was a critic of Athenian democracy. And again, his typology of governments reflect his belief that the best kinds of government balance the interests, the potential rival interests within a given city-state or polity. So are many ordinary heads better than a few good ones? Aristotle's response to the claim that the affairs of state should be left to those of status, he argues, would you prefer one without skill at healing to act as a physician? That's his kind of way of saying, well, this is a strong argument. But again, he's pointing out, although individually the demos may be worse than those with specialized knowledge, collectively they tend to be better. And in fact, he makes the argument that even doctors would be more likely to consult with other doctors than to rely solely on their own judgment. Again, reflecting this idea that it's good to combine ideas, to combine the skill sets of a physician, of a variety of physicians, rather than simply to rely on one person's judgment. And he also argues that the many are better still when guided and constrained by sound laws. Again, this idea that we need to live within a system of rule of law. That if people are prepared to set aside the rule of law, then lawlessness is likely to prevail. And lawlessness is unlikely to work to the benefit of anyone other than those people acting lawlessly. So what is the best constitution? For Aristotle, he relies a lot on what was known as the doctrine of the mean. The doctrine of the mean is part of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And he found at the time that various virtues lie between extremes or excesses and deficiencies. So for example, Aristotle believed that courage lay at the mean between cowardice on the one hand and foolhardiness on the other. So he pointed out that there were three classes within any community's of inhabitants: those that were very rich, those that were very poor, and those that lay within the mean of those two extremes. So while the very wealthy tend to be very arrogant and unwilling to submit to any authority, the very poor are likewise too degraded to govern out of any spirit but that of grievance. So what does that leave you? That leaves you a group of people who lay in the middle class. They don't live in palaces, neither do they live in hovels. They love their homes, they love their families. They want to preserve those things. They may be willing to invest in things that improve the livelihoods of everyone, but they're far less likely to be overambitious for power. So they're not likely to shrink from rule, nor are they likely to take rule and push it beyond reasonable boundaries. So for Aristotle, he basically thinks that the seat of prudence lies in the middle class. He makes the great quote, "A city of masters and slaves cannot be virtuous. A city that is controlled by its middle class is secure in its goods and not envious of the possessions of its neighbors." He quotes Phocylides, "Many things are best in the mean. I desire to belong to the middle class of my city." And then a great quote from Aristotle, "Great then is the good fortune of a state in which the citizens have a moderate and sufficient property. For where some possess much and the others nothing, there may arise an extreme democracy or a pure oligarchy." So those are sort of the founding notions of what democracy is and how it works. And as I mentioned, democracy really falls apart because there's no kind of governing unit capable of securing democracy in the ancient world. Like I said, there were really only two basic units of political organization in the ancient world: city-states and empires. And empires had the tendency of swallowing up city-states, and empires make for very infertile soil for democracy. So democracy kind of leaves the stage for a significant period of time. It begins to emerge in the aftermath of the feudal era, okay? And it really draws both on ancient Greece and Rome. And it is basically fed by what we tend to describe as the Renaissance, the revival of European society and culture and its emergence from feudalism. So what is republicanism? It basically, a republic is a contraction of the Latin term res publica, which refers to a public thing. Polybius, who was a Greek who spent most of his adult life as a hostage in Athens, or in Rome, and became sort of a Roman, kind of an adopted Roman, really came to love the Roman republican system of government. So the Roman system of government reflected an early manifestation of what we might describe as popular sovereignty, which is again the sense in which the authority and the legitimacy of a government stems from the consent of a people. So you had a very durable empire that lasts for close to half a millennium, several hundred years, which is that's pretty durable. So what were the keys to Rome's success? First of all, again, they recognized that there were a number of powerful factions in the original kind of Roman city-state. They set up a system in which no one faction of Roman society could consistently take and hold on to power. There were the founding tribes of Rome. And again, these were what we might call an aristocracy, if you will. These were the landed, powerful families. And they drew allegiance from the citizens of Rome and built Rome into, again, a powerhouse that would ultimately conquer all of the Italian peninsula and ultimately Gaul and much of the Middle East and Spain and most of northern Africa. But the argument basically was republican government fostered concern for the good of the whole, while democracy had a tendency to foment division and conflict. So what led to the death of the Roman Republic? Well, a number of things. One was the mounting burdens of empire. You had the politics of pacifying a restive citizenry. They provided lots and lots of public games, bread and circus, if you will. Then ultimately you had the rise of a very powerful noble in Julius Caesar, and ultimately his assassination, which is a cautionary tale for anyone. When you seek to return to a previous virtue through killing, you will ultimately find that the ends do not justify the means. And in fact, you will find that corrupt means inevitably corrupt ends. So you had the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire from, and into the Dark Ages, which last well into the 14th century AD, after the Christian era. Republican and democratic thought is really kind of laying fallow in this period. Another important issue that we have to address is the relationship between Christianity and democracy. So Christianity has a complicated relationship with democracy. It's important to keep in mind the early church, the first century church, was radically democratic. Pictured on this slide is a part of a cover from Ali Cautez's 2019 book, Marrying the Early Christian Women, which basically acknowledged first and foremost all were equal before God, as in the early Gospels. In the first century, the Christian church accepted slaves. Many women were part of the church leadership in that first century. Ultimately, what happens is that, and again, it's important to keep in mind that the church was a persecuted sect in those early years. And as a result, the early Christian church adopted a sort of apolitical stance. Early Christianity, the focus was on the spiritual rather than the secular. Jesus' synoptic Gospels reads, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. That was a political admonition of the early church. And that was that a Christian's home was in heaven. And that Jesus's quietism was telling Christians, obey those in power and seek no power for yourself. Nevertheless, the early Roman, the Roman Empire was hostile to Christianity because they viewed Christianity as a Jewish sect. And remember, Judaism was a real source of political discord in the Roman Empire in the time of Augustus and Tiberius, those first initial Roman emperors. And so they had a tendency to persecute first and ask questions later. And there were several really terrible persecutions of early Christians. And of course, Daniel in the lion's den, or all, whoever, the variety of stories of Christians being fed to wild animals and forced to fight in gladiator events. This was sort of commonplace. And then in 303 AD, you have a transforming event, the Edict of Milan, which officially extended religious tolerance throughout the empire, and basically marked a period in which persecution would no longer be the policy of the Roman Empire regarding Christianity. The Edict of Milan has the consequence also of facilitating the Christianization of the Roman Empire, transitioning it to what we would then become the Holy Roman Empire. And so Christianity transitions rather rapidly, almost overnight, from being a persecuted sect to being the official religion of the most powerful empire in the world, albeit an empire that was beginning to show cracks. So the main internal threats to the church and the church's response both to internal and external threats basically was orthodoxy and increasingly authoritarianism. The main internal threats to Christianity came from schismatic sects. Of course, the Great Schism, which would separate Christianity and what would become the Catholic Church from Eastern Orthodoxy, was one of those early kind of traumas. But then you also had other schismatic sects like the Montanists, who lived in modern-day Turkey, and the Donatists, who were in modern-day Africa. And so again, the church's response to those kinds of threats was to say, first and foremost, the Pope shall be the final word in all matters of gospel and doctrinal, purity, and any brooking of the authority of the church could result in, excommunication, which is, again, the damnation of a person's soul. And so as the empire's church, it became the power behind the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. And the result of that was centuries of conflict and intrigue that kind of morphs into feudalism as a result of invasions from Eastern Asian, horse civilizations, if you will, the Mongols, the Huns, then the Mongols, the Magyars, and so on. The church became more and more entangled in secular politics over time. By the time you hit the high medieval period, the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, is effectively a secular power. It governs the papal states, which were a variety of shifting territories in central Italy. They fielded armies to pursue and to advance the secular authority of the church. Voltaire in 1716, writing kind of retrospectively, would ironically argue that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And so the church becomes an integral part of what would become the feudal order that would dominate sort of post-Roman civilization. Okay? Feudalism was a response, again, to a series of foreign invasions. Among those external threats to Europe over the course of the feudal era, again, included the Magyars, the Huns, the Mongols, and of course the Vikings, of the early feudal era, as well as the threats from Islamic, movements in the South and in Western Europe in the later medieval period. Of course, the Muslims would invade and successfully occupy Spain for over 500 years. They laid siege to Constantinople and ultimately took Constantinople eventually. And so that kind of presents enormous, and really significant threats to what we now consider to be Western civilization, and that creates a kind of retrenchment. Okay, feudalism is effectively kind of the creation of a series of laager societies built around castles and fortified positions, and it sharply differentiates between those people designated for defensive society and those people designated for the defense of people's souls, and those people who are dedicated to growing food and keeping everybody else alive. The overwhelming majority of Europeans were what we would call serfs, which meant they had no political rights, they had no real political or social status. They could be used however the other classes of people chose to use them. On the other hand, the church had real authority, wielded real secular authority because of their spiritual control over people's lives. The church was also widely viewed as an avenue for advancement, both for the nobility and for serfs. Talented serfs who were very intelligent could enter the church and become, priests. Nobles could become, the lesser sons of the nobility entered the church, and through the church, again, found ways of advancing their family's interests. So, the essence of feudalism, though, was a highly organic notion of society. And this is a view, we'll talk about this more when we get to different ideologies. When you view society as an organism, you are basically saying that it's the sum of its constituent parts, but its parts are different, right? And the serfs were basically, you were tied to the land. If you were born a serf, the overwhelming likelihood was that you would die a serf. And so it was a highly class-based society with, again, the feudal, the nobility sitting at the top, the church sitting almost alongside, and then a vast, array of serfs that really had very little in the way of social status or rights. Now, again, over time, those rigid social boundaries and divisions would begin eroding. And what begins to change that? Well, a couple of things. The populations begin to expand, and the economies begin to loosen up gradually over time, resulting from a couple of different factors that I'll talk about in a minute. But a system of ascribed status is very difficult to maintain because human beings want to be able to make use of their abilities, and serfs really had no real rights or powers to speak of. And that created over time a great deal of resentment. So that leads to the ideas that begins to emerge with the Renaissance, okay? And again, the Renaissance and ultimately the Reformation are enormously transformative events. These are a series of social, economic, and political, events that really begin with the Crusades, okay? So the politics of the Crusades. There's a phrase that the Crusaders used to chant when they were entering battle, Deus Vult. This is something that's actually a tattoo on the current Secretary of Defense. It basically means God wills it. This was, the Crusades began with Pope Urban II's, demand for a holy war after the Muslims had taken Jerusalem. This led to a massive mobilization of much of the nobility of Europe in a series of massive movements, military movements into the Levant, the area of the Eastern Mediterranean, which is now Lebanon, Israel, Syria, and Jordan, and elsewhere. And a number of things occurred as a result of the Crusades. First and foremost, one thing is that it thinned out the nobility quite a bit. Many of the nobility that went into the Middle East never returned. They oftentimes took up lands in the Middle East and stayed there and took their families there. Another important thing was that you saw the recovery of many classical texts that had otherwise been destroyed or were hidden away in monasteries in Europe. Aristotle, the recovery of several of Aristotle's texts were especially important. Some of the great revisions of the high medieval period would occur because of the church attempting to figure out how Aristotle could be Christianized, if you will. And so you also had a series of enormous populist peasant movements in this period as well. And you had a series right around the time of the Protestant Reformation, of what we called the Peasant Wars, where again the nobility of Eastern Europe rose, basically found themselves spending decades suppressing rebellions, oftentimes of peasants who were claiming religious sanctions for rising up, for rebelling. So you had a renewed concern for secular affairs. There was a spreading belief that personal liberty was a value worth defending against the feudal order. You had the growing economic opportunities provided by increased commerce from the Middle East. Again, those folks that went on the Crusades went over there in ships, and they oftentimes came back in ships. They came into the ports in Florence and in Naples and in other large Italian ports, and they were bringing with them the riches of the Middle East. They were bringing back gold. They were bringing back spices. They were bringing back valuable items, silk, and things like that. And they were oftentimes finding it difficult to move all those goods, and that led to a massive expansion of banking in this high medieval period in Italy. And Italy became a source of enormous wealth. It had been a backwater of sorts for some time, a place where the great powers of Spain and the Catholic Church and Austria, the Habsburg Empire in Austria and France were basically stalemating themselves, and that was, again, it became a collision zone. And so you began seeing in Italy in this period of time the formation of the Atlantic tradition. And the key elements of the Atlantic tradition are liberalism, virtue, and a hostility to corruption. And now again, we'll be talking more about what liberalism means. Originally, it simply means open-minded, open-handed. Over time, it takes on more values. Virtue, again, was the idea that we can live in a society that works for everyone. And finally, the hostility to corruption, which, again, feudalism, was itself an increasingly corrupt system. And one of the things that would give rise to the Protestant Reformation was the corruption of the church. At the time that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Brandenburg Church, the Pope at the time, Leo X, was one of the most spectacularly venal figures in church history. He had a zoo with elephants and animals. He was collecting art. The Catholic Church was, increasingly demanding large amounts of tithes from Northern Europe, which was again a fairly economically prosperous place. But not many people could afford to go from, Poland or Germany to, Italy to view all these splendors, the Sistine Chapel that they were busy building at the time. And infamously, of course, the church was in the process of, basically selling indulgences. What was an indulgence? It was basically checkbook salvation. You give a large donation to the church, and they, basically forgive you your sins. So you could be washed clean of any horrible thing you might otherwise have done. One of the most, interestingly and distinctively modern thinkers, and then again, it's important to keep in mind, there are two what we consider to be of the really first modern thinkers. The first is Machiavelli, which we'll deal with now. Later, we'll deal with Thomas Hobbes. And what makes them distinctively modern, but also not entirely modern, is that they are really transitional figures. Machiavelli, again, he emerges in Florentine politics. Again, Florence was one of the city-states of medieval Italy. Again, it was one of those, city-states that had benefited a great deal from, the Renaissance, from the emergence of art and banking and money in this high medieval period. And Machiavelli was one of the first to think in kind of distinctively modern terms, because most people wrote, to the extent that they wrote in epistolary form, which is to say, in the form of some sort of religious writing. Machiavelli was really not that guy. He was not the kind of person that thought in moral terms, because he lived in such a cynical age. And he was the first to really look at politics as a distinct kind of activity from moral or ethical concerns, which again dominated the way people thought in that period. Machiavelli wrote quite a bit because he spent quite a bit of his time in exile. And he wrote the two books that he's famous for were The Prince and the Discourses on Livy. The Prince, they were both written in the early 16th century, but were not published until after his death. He spent much of his life, he was a Florentine diplomat and statesperson who, when the Medici family took over Florentine politics, he was on the outs because he was a member of the Republican faction. They believed in Republican government. And Machiavelli, as a diplomat, was, I think, when he wrote The Prince, was attempting to try to rehabilitate himself with the Medici. And he wrote The Prince as a sort of epistolary to Lorenzo de' Medici, who was oftentimes described as Lorenzo the Magnificent, because again, he owned the biggest bank in Florence and was a very, again, generous patron of the arts. And so the prince is notable for just how cynical it was in how it described the way politics can and should be practiced. It's not ironic. The person that's depicted on this slide is Caesar Borgia, who Machiavelli at various points points to approvingly. And again, I like to refer back to Sheldon Wallen's book on politics and vision. His chapter on Machiavelli, the organizing theme around it was what he called the political economy of violence. And his argument is that Machiavelli is distinct and original in that he looked at violence not as something to be abhorred and avoided, but as something like an ingredient for any kind of a food dish. That it's like a spice. If you use it in the right measure, it can improve the dish. And he was basically saying that violence, selectively employed, can actually lead to the stability of society. It can save a prince many future fights if you kill the right people in small measure. And in fact, it can have a demonstration effect. And so in effect, he's basically saying that violence is just a thing. It's just a thing that rulers, it's a tool that a prince has in their toolkit that they can use or decline to use. Sometimes a prince would benefit from restraining their hand. And Machiavelli conceded that. He's basically saying that the best way to view political violence is to use it as little as possible, but to not be afraid to use it when you must. And he tells the story of Caesar Borgia, who, again, to get a sense of just how corrupt the times were. Caesar Borgia was a Spanish noble person who was the illegitimate son of the Pope of that time, Alexander II, I believe. And so he was named a duke, an Italian duke, and he was basically the instrument of the Pope in this period. And at one point, he was tasked with taking over a town and stopping a really ugly blood feud that had occurred between two warring families. Think about Romeo and Juliet. And so Borgia took up and just, he reconnoitered the situation. He figured out who was the one person in town that was the most violent and was the most notable. And he took him and cut him in two and placed him in the square, pointing at the two warring factions. And Machiavelli cites this as sort of in an approving sense as, here's how you stop a blood feud. Okay? And so, unsurprisingly at the time, because again, nobody spoke this way about violence. This was, again, where Christianity was the dominant mode of political discourse. It was widely condemned for this idea that the ends justifies the means, and the suggestion that rulers could not be held to the same moral standards as individual citizens because they might at times have to do terrible things in order to secure the state itself. And again, his citation of Caesar Borgia was an illustration of the desirability of a ruthless and decisive ruler. But at the same time, Machiavelli would later say, well, Borgia failed. And why did he fail? Well, because Alexander, his patron, Alexander II, died. And he lacked patronage in the aftermath of that. But he had made many enemies. And he was ultimately killed in Spain by rivals. So the Prince is one kind of writing that Machiavelli employed. He also wrote the Discourses on Livy, which is a much more straightforward work of history, but it also includes a clear advocacy of Republican government. And first, he argues a Republican state must be independent of outside forces. And he notes that the problem for Florence's independence was the presence of all these powerful, growing, this was the period of the emerging nation state. You had the Habsburg Empire, the Austrians, you had the French, you had the Spanish, all seeking influence and seeking to control Italy and the wealth of Italy. And so city-states like Florence had a difficult time in sustaining their independence. And one of the things he condemns the Medici for was throwing their fortunes with the French. So second, a Republican government must have citizens who were both knowledgeable and willing to defend their freedom. And so among the necessary ingredients for an independent republic is the idea of a citizenry imbued with the spirit of virtue. Now, what did he mean by virtue? He did not mean Christian virtue, which he connoted to mean a kind of passivity, a kind of piety. Okay? So for Machiavelli, virtue contrasts with the Christian notion of virtue and refers to that martial willingness to defend one's political community. So for Machiavelli, virtue meant skill, bravery, leadership, and a willingness to get dirty hands in the defense of community. Machiavelli believed Christian virtue or moral goodness was not an ideal, and in fact it tended to deprive citizens of that spirit, that willingness to do what is necessary, in the rough and tumble world of politics. So which Machiavelli is the guy that we should listen to? This selection is actually from the Discourses. And again, it is written in a decidedly Republican tone. And the question that he is asking, what is wrong with princely rule? So he asked the question, are the people more wise and constant than princes? Because again, at that period of time, most people viewed, the prince, the nobility, if you will, as natural rulers. That's what they're there for. There's a very naturalistic fallacy. You're a noble, therefore you're capable of ruling. He quotes the ancient Roman Livy. It is the nature of the multitude either too humbly to serve or insolently to dominate. So for the ancients, and again, this is kind of a spirit that Machiavelli is very subtly rebelling against. And remember, this is a guy who was in exile, who had been tortured by the Medici, and who could be tortured again if they discovered him scribbling, radical ideas. Machiavelli questions whether the same character flaws can't be detected in those individuals described as princes. That the wrong people, be they noble or otherwise, placed in positions of authority may behave imprudently. Both princes and the people are likely to fall into error when there is no check on their behavior. And that gets, back to this idea that republicanism is democracy, but it's democracy within limits. It's democracy constrained by the law. And so again, Machiavelli would note that, that corruption is the enemy of any Republican government. Machiavelli described corruption as the love of wealth, the love of luxury and ease, together with a corresponding indifference to public affairs. And so Machiavelli believed that the greatest threat to Republican governance is internal dissolution via corruption. This would be something that John Adams would later write too as well, one of our founding fathers. He would say democracy, any familiarity with classical writings would demonstrate to you that democracies soon waste, exhaust, and murder themselves. And so republicanism survives so long as it retains those republican restraints. So to that end, in much of his writings, he basically said, we have to organize a republican society to instill virtue if you will, within citizens, the willingness to basically, fight for what you deserve. Machiavelli hated mercenary armies. He actually wrote one of his big books was on war, where he inveighed consistently against the idea of hiring mercenary armies. What was the problem with mercenary armies? They're cynical. They are professional. They're apt to switch sides if the other side can pay more money. Right? He strongly advocated the idea of raising and training citizen militias for Republican self-defense. This is an argument that informed the framers of our Constitution. Keep in mind, that under the original Constitution, the military, we would never have had a permanent military establishment until well into the 20th century, because the framers and our political traditions were strongly hostile to the idea of professional soldiers. You had to have people who were citizens first. So Machiavelli had the conviction that Republican government demanded rule of law and not the rule by the whim or caprice of any one person or even a majority within a community. Again, because, like Aristotle, he believed that populaces, ultimately many heads would be better, more likely to come to good outcomes. But even wise heads can be stampeded. Okay? So you have to be constrained by the law. So for Machiavelli, this is another Latin phrase, vox populi, vox Dei. And that is a Latin term, basically saying the voice of the people is the voice of God. And so for all the flaws and foibles of the people, popular rule suffers no comparison with those of princes. In cities where the people are the masters, we see the greatest progress in the least possible time, because everybody's got their oars in the water and they're pulling together. Whenever the rule by the people or rule by princes has lasted for a long time, both are regulated by laws. And in essence, what he means there is that even princes can be effective, provided that they play by the rules of the game. The problem with princes is they tend to reject the idea of restraint. They tend to think that they are above the law, that they are superior to the laws that are designed to constrain powerful people. There are various points in this presentation where you could apply what we're talking about regarding republicanism to what we're going through today. I'll give you an example. Right now, I think it was last night or maybe yesterday, President Donald Trump, signed an executive order banning the burning of flags. Now, I was born and raised on a military base. Both my parents were U.S. Army officers. I revere the flag. I do not like people burning the flag. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court has ruled that people burning the flag, be it the U.S. flag, be it the the flag of Israel, that is a form of political speech, and consequently it is judged to be constitutional. The Supreme Court ruled in Texas v. Johnson. This was in 1989. As a result of a case, Texas had a law banning the burning of the U.S. flag. A protester outside the Republican convention in Houston burned an American flag and was arrested. The Supreme Court ultimately heard that case, and a conservative justice, Anthony Kennedy, wrote the opinion and basically said, yes, it's offensive speech. It is also political speech. The First Amendment doesn't just protect the speech that we agree with. And so what is the likelihood that Donald Trump's executive order will be challenged and struck down? At some point, I suspect that he doesn't really care whether it's struck down or not. What he wants to do is cause Democrats to denounce him, and then he gets to say, see, the Democrats are a bunch of flag burners. That's the kind of politics that we're dealing with today. That's what ideology causes a lot of people to do. And so you have to be able to see these things clearly. And again, part of the challenge that we have with ideology is that it can put beer goggles on our perceptions. So when we come back, we are going to continue our discussion of the democratic ideal, how democracy began to recover its prevalence, its attractiveness to people in the early modern era, and increasingly, and again, the United States became an independent nation at a very propitious time when these kinds of ideas were beginning to really develop a strong following. And fortunately, the political elites that helped draft our founding Constitution were versed in those new currents. They wanted to believe in democracy, but they wanted to believe in a specific kind of democracy, a democracy constrained by good laws, by principles like the separation of powers and federalism. These are principles and laws that are calculated to keep us governing in a reasonable and rational way. I'll see you next time.